Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry for being a couple minutes late. Where were we? Where are we? Where are we going? Some of you are working on assignment 2, some on 3 and or 4. Questions about the assignments? Everyone installed PyBullet? Good, okay. All right, so let's carry on then. We will finish up our introduction to the course today by talking about embodied cognition. This is sort of the philosophical underpinning for most of what we're going to focus on in this course. Embodied cognition in a nutshell. In order to act intelligently and safely in the world, you need to be able to push against the world, literally or figuratively, and observe how the world pushes back. And that loop from action to reaction is necessary for building intelligent and safe behavior, regardless of whether you're an organism or a machine. That is a philosophical stance. You may or may not agree with it, but it's going to sort of guide a lot of what we cover in this course. Not everyone working on trying to create intelligent and safe machines believes that. AI and machine learning, a lot of it is focused on non-embodied cognition. Collect enough data or passively be given enough data from someone or something out there, do enough cogitation and you'll figure it out. Two different approaches. We're going to learn about embodied cognition today by looking at a lot of different building blocks of intelligence. As we saw when we talked about a short history of AI, if you think about it, it's hard to actually sit down and formally define what intelligence is. Something that's a little bit easier is enumerating all the things that need to go into an organism or a machine to make it intelligent. We can then think about trying to build those building blocks of intelligence into machines, and we can try and build them into machines in a non-embodied way or an embodied way. That's what we're going to look at today. Lecture 3 is a little bit of a shorter lecture, so we may be able to push on to the tools of the trade and lecture 4. We'll see how we go this morning. Okay, so let's start our journey into embodied cognition with sort of an obvious building block of intelligence, which is pattern recognition. If you're not able to recognize patterns out there in the world, again, regardless of whether you're an organism or machine, you're going to have a hard time. Hard to distinguish between patterns that represent friend, patterns that represent foe, patterns that represent food, patterns that represent poison, and so on and so forth. Same thing for autonomous vehicles. Hard to be a good autonomous vehicle if you can't tell the difference between a tire tread mark on the road and a young child that's run out into the middle of the road. Kind of important to be able to recognize patterns out there in the world. It's so obvious maybe, but it's maybe worth saying because as we continue, we're going to see more and more building blocks of intelligence that maybe are not so obvious as being necessary. Okay, pattern recognition. Going back a few decades to, let's say, maybe the 1970s or 80s, computer vision started to arise. The cameras were becoming cheaper and cheaper in the 70s and 80s, and it was getting easier to connect cameras to computers, which led to the obvious question is, can we feed in camera images into a computer and can it start to recognize things or folks in that video stream? Like, for example, this person who is not that old, am I? Marilyn Monroe. Okay, good. All right. You all did it. Hopefully you did it effortlessly. You maybe didn't even realize you were doing it while I was talking. It's so effortless, it maybe is going to take us 2 months with a bunch of my buddies to figure it out and so on and so forth, right? It feels obvious and easy to do. Thinking about thinking is misleading. When folks in the 70s and 80s sat down to write computer programs or algorithms that would take as input a photograph and spit out Marilyn Monroe or dog or cat or whatever you like, turned out to be very, very difficult. So the overall problem of computer vision, getting a computer to tell you what's in the picture, they started to break it down into sub-problems, and one of them became known as image segmentation. Most images that humans are interested in have something that's sort of interest in the foreground, and then everything else we're not interested in the background. So you can take the overall problem of pattern recognition and break it down into, can you visit all of the pixels in this image and tag each pixel as either foreground, or background. And you can see the results of an early image segmenter trying to do this. Tricky. Why? Why is this tricky? Again, for you, it was effortless. You probably did it in a millionth of a second.
Because from the computers, it's changing colors.
Changing colors, right. So Marilyn happens to be on a black background here, but you could probably also recognize her if she was on a white background or yellow background. So whatever your image segmentation algorithm is going to have to be, it can't rely on if a pixel is light colored, it's probably in the foreground, and if it's dark colored, it's in the background. That doesn't work. Trust me, a lot of those ideas or those heuristics, folks tried them early on. Remember ELIZA, we talked about last time, was a big if-then-else statement, and people were engaged with ELIZA. It seemed to be working. This is the answer. If we want to make intelligent machines, we just need to write a long piece of code with a whole bunch of if-then-else statements. So let's do the same with this. Take in a whole bunch of pixel intensities and run some big if-then-else statement. Set of statements. Tricky. Why else? Can't rely on color.
There's some pretty heavy nuance in terms of if you're just looking at the color, like we know that her foot is connected to her shoulder, but also not connected to the bar in the background, despite those three objects sharing a similar shade.
Absolutely. You're bringing a lot of knowledge about the world to this problem, right? Which maybe we could build in. Maybe we write a foot recognizer and look for a shoulder recognizer. It's also tricky. I'm going to challenge you periodically in this class to militate against your intuition. It feels easy to do this problem. It's not. But why? Why is it not hard? Your visual system is telling your brain right now that it's an easy problem. I want you to try and ignore your visual system. Why is this hard?
We have to take context from other areas of the image.
Okay.
If we were given like one pixel, like it's you're given one pixel at a time, then we also would be able to tell what's in the foreground, what's in the background.
Absolutely, right? So you're obviously comparing relative pixel intensities all over this image all the time. As you're looking at this picture, your eyes are saccading, which means you shift what you're looking at every 1/10 of a second. It feels like you're kind of looking at everything up here at the front of the room at the same time. You're not. You're actually seeing through a pinhole camera, more or less, that's jumping around every 1/10 of a second, and you're applying context. I see a more or less white pixel here. I jump, I see black, I jump back. I see a flesh color here. I jump up 2/3 in the image and I see something that looks a bit like a shoulder. We start to cobble together context, which again you can do with a whole bunch of if-then-else statements. Very, very difficult to do and near impossible to do by hand. Okay, this used to be a hard problem in computer science. It no longer is because we got rid of the if-then-else statements. And what do we do instead? Neural networks, right? So with 1 million images of Marilyn and 1 million more images of things that don't contain Marilyn, and someone telling us which is which, telling the deep learner which is which, it can eventually learn to do it, and it can learn to do it pretty well with enough data, and in some cases do it better than humans. That's the non-embodied approach. It does work, requires a lot of data. Here's the embodied approach to pattern recognition. This is BabyBot, sometimes known as COG. Here's a cartoon of BabyBot. You can see immediately that it has eyes, it has cameras, so it's trying to recognize patterns in the world, but it also has an arm and a hand. BabyBot can literally push against the world, and with its cameras, it can literally see how the world pushes back. Okay, how does this work? Let's imagine we put a whole bunch of fruit in front of BabyBot. Let's assume BabyBot has little to no information at all about the outside world. Basically no information, thus the name BabyBot. We're kind of starting from scratch here. Imagine that BabyBot doesn't know nothing, it knows a little bit. It knows that it can send electricity to a bunch of motors And it also knows, or it gets back camera images. It gets back 2 images from its 2 cameras. If, like your 2 eyes, if you put those 2 images coming from 2 eyes or 2 cameras together in the right way, you can get 3D information. We're not going to do any of that fancy stuff, or BabyBot is not going to do any of that fancy stuff. BabyBot is just going to take these 2 images and go through them and actually compare these images against the previous image that came from the camera. So we're looking at 2 images superimposed, but they're superimposed in time. And BabyBot, as shown in the upper right here, is going to gray out every pixel that didn't change in intensity since the last time step. And it's going to leave not grayed out any pixel that changed in intensity since the previous time step. This is something that the human investigators built into BabyBot. So BabyBot gets this out of the box. Why? What were the investigators doing here? What are they giving BabyBot by doing this?
It's kind of a form of segmentation where it's like when it interacts with something, it isolates that object so it's easy to identify what it is.
It isolates that object because it's easy to isolate that object, but easy because it can see movement, right? So over here, these panels here assume everything that's grayed out is not moving in BabyBot's field of view, and everything that's not grayed out is moving. Okay, so that's going to help with image segmentation to some degree. Assume these fruits are not rolling around on the table, and assume BabyBot is still. What does BabyBot see at that point in time? Absolutely nothing. If BabyBot is still and the world in front of BabyBot is still, BabyBot doesn't see anything yet. Okay, so that's what happens right at the beginning. BabyBot sees nothing. BabyBot knows that it can send electricity to the motors. It rolls a 6-sided die. Let's assume it has 6 motors. The number comes up 3, so it sends electricity to motor 3. That's all BabyBot knows. And all of a sudden, when it does that, suddenly a blob appears in its field of view. Let's assume this is motor 3. Immediately, BabyBot has pushed against the world, where in this case, the world is its shoulder, kind of an odd definition, and something has happened. The world has pushed back. BabyBot is surprised or gets this new piece of data and stops sending electricity to motor 3. What happens?
It stops.
The arm stops, but BabyBot knows nothing about arms and stop. From BabyBot's point of view, what happens? The blob disappears. BabyBot suddenly realizes every time it sends electricity to motor 3, and it doesn't really matter how much or how little electricity it sends, this blob shows up, and then whenever it stops sending electricity, that blob disappears. Interesting. Immediately, BabyBot starts to learn a relationship between actions and sensory repercussions. In a lot of what we're going to see in this course, we've got a robot or organism that acts on the environment, and the environment provides a sensory repercussion to that action. Okay, let's assume from BabyBot's point of view, it learns this relationship and decides to call this blob self. It's probably not the English word self, it comes up with some hashtag, it doesn't really matter. It comes up with some name for this thing. And if we were to ask BabyBot, what is self? BabyBot's definition of self would be what? It knows there's this thing out there, this blob. From BabyBot's point of view, what definition might it give you of what this thing is? If I were to ask you for a definition of what this thing is hanging off the end of your right shoulder, what would you say? It's my arm. You'd use a noun. You're probably unlikely to use a verb. It's an arm. It's my arm. What about BabyBot? Would BabyBot just say it's self? It actually, BabyBot has already at this point learned something about this thing.
This thing is some sort of voltage differential to motor 3.
It's a voltage differential. Maybe. It does know something about that. So that's part of the answer that it might give you, right? When I send electricity to motor 3,
It's the thing that moves when I send electricity to motor 3.
it's the thing that moves when I send electricity to motor 3. It's the thing that moves when I send. There's two verbs in that sentence. Again, thinking about thinking is misleading. If you think about the parts that make up you and the stuff around you, typically when humans are asked questions about what's a chair, what's a shoulder, what's a wrist, what's a foot, they tend to give nouns. But when you think about it, a good definition of all of these things is not really captured by just a noun. It's some description of this thing. When I do this, this is what happens. When I send electricity to motor 3, I see a blob of about this size and this shape. Question?
Wouldn't it just be that it appears, not that it moves? Like, how does BabyBot have a conception of motion?
Okay, yeah, I guess I didn't give you details. We can make it up. It doesn't really matter too much. When we're if it continues to send electricity to motor 3, it sees a blob of this shape entering the right field of view and moving to the left, let's say. If it sends electricity to motor 2, now it sees that blob moving in the opposite direction. This description for BabyBot might actually be more complicated, but when you boil down that complicated description, it's still something like, when I do this, this is the sensory repercussion I tend to get. Yeah? It might not feel like it to you, but your definition of shoulder is when your motor system in your brain sends commands to muscles in about this region. There's a set of familiar sensations you get back. That's kind of a more precise definition of your shoulder than it's the thing that's there. That might feel like the definition, but we often skip over this part. Okay, let's keep going with BabyBot. So it's exploring itself. It's sending electricity to different motors, and it starts to see different things happening, and so it might start to refine its definition of self, but then all of a sudden, something unexpected happens. What happened? Okay, it touched the apple, which we know from a distal perspective. We know there's an apple there. We can see that. Let's take the proximate view. Step into BabyBot's shoes, although it doesn't have any. Take the perspective of BabyBot. From BabyBot's perspective, what happened? A new blob appeared. Perfect. Okay, now you're speaking BabyBot's language. A new blob appeared. BabyBot is surprised and stops sending electricity to motor 3. What happens? The blob disappears. Okay. So is this blob, what do we call this blob? What properties, what sensor motor properties does it have? What does BabyBot know about this new blob?
Does it not just know the same things that it knows about its arm?
Does it? Does this new blob that BabyBot has discovered, does it act the same? Does it have the same properties as this other blob, which I'm calling self?
It appears when it moves its arm for a certain period of time.
It doesn't always appear. Self always appears. Well, let's assume that its arm is always in its field of view. This blob called self, whenever I send electricity to these motors, it always shows up. And whenever I stop, it always disappears. But that's not true for this thing. This thing appears sometimes, less often. We'll call it world, or everything else. From BabyBot's perspective, there's self and everything else. Another reason why BabyBot is called BabyBot is because BabyBot was inspired by some work in developmental psychology. Developmental psychology is the study of psychology specifically focused on human development or babies. How do small humans grow into bigger humans? One of the things that human babies and a lot of other animal babies need to struggle with at the beginning is where does me end and where does everything else begin? For a lot of babies, mom is basically part of me. Every time I scream and cry, there's something I can always do where I immediately get the sensory repercussion of mom, warmth, hug, food, nurturing, you name it, right? Eventually, though, you learn that that's not quite true. These distinctions start to arise for babies and for BabyBot as it acts in the world. Okay, what else does it know about this new blob? What else might happen as BabyBot is just kind of exploring and happens to poke the apple? What else can happen? Suddenly BabyBot makes a new discovery. It's possible to do an action and get an immediate sensory repercussion, which is the reappearance of this round blob, which I'm going to call world. But sometimes when I stop acting, the sensory repercussion persists beyond the cessation or the stopping of the action. Well, that's weird. I've never seen that before. Okay. BabyBot says, all right, well, that's world. World acts differently than self. Fine, no problem. Okay. It doesn't know apple yet, but it's starting to learn something about a larger class of things. What is it implicitly learning by mistake through acting in the world? It's learning physics. It's not just learning image segmentation, it's learning other stuff inevitably along the way. Let's assume BabyBot keeps moving around and pick another fruit there on the table. What happens? What other kinds of discoveries can BabyBot make in this very simple situation?
Better feel like more resistance from a heavier object.
Okay, yeah, so maybe it comes into contact with the grapes and they just happen to, scrape a little bit along the ground, and BabyBot is actually feeling other things like resistance. This blob actually slows down even though I'm sending the same amount of electricity. I've never seen that before. And this self seems to slow down whenever it comes into contact with a blob that looks like this. Assume the grapes actually are also moving. Yeah? So now BabyBot says, whoa, wait a second. There's multiple blobs that exist in this thing I'm calling world, and some of these blobs resist my own motion, resist the motion of self, and other things do resist it. Okay, so I'm going to come up with two new terms. Throw away this term world, and I'm now going to have light and heavy. What other discoveries can it make? Just with the pieces of fruit you see here. What else can happen?
Like squish the fruit.
Right, okay. Staying with the grapes, it does this, and then says, wow, wait a second. Blobs can actually change in shape. And I take my hand away, and the shape hasn't changed. Okay, there are actions I can perform on world or on heavy that cause it to change shape, and then stay that shape. So I'm going to add another distinction. Squishable things and non-squishable things. BabyBot is now stumbled into the world of adverbs. There are things, when I do them, when I squish something, there's a certain kind of reaction to that particular kind of action. When I do this to blobs that I set in motion in the world, some change shapes, some don't resist changing shape, so there's going to be things called hard things and soft things, other things I press. What else can happen? Actually, a lot of things can happen here.
If one of the fruits gets away from it, it'll become smaller.
Absolutely. So maybe it pokes the orange like this, and the blob persists. And BabyBot says, oh yeah, good old round things. Those things tend to persist after I've touched them. Things that have this shape tend to persist. They roll. But now suddenly one of them is rolling and getting smaller, right? So BabyBot cannot see in the third dimension, but maybe it starts to say, well, there are things that get smaller when they're round and when I go like this. One of the advantages of embodied cognition is by acting in the world, you set in motion, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, a lot of these things, and you shake loose a lot of information about the world. Of course, we could train any foundation model these days on what are apples and bananas and grapes and so on with enough photographs. But what's the limitation of that approach? If it runs into something it hasn't seen before, yeah, so absolutely, number one problem in AI, what happens when you expose a trained machine to things it hasn't seen before. BabyBot maybe has the same problem. There's certain things that you could throw at it that it wouldn't know what is going to result. Other limitations or current disadvantages of just training a foundation model on huge numbers of images of fruit.
Because you're learning a lot more when you're touching it.
You're learning a lot more when you're touching it. Somebody mentioned physics already. The kind of knowledge or the kind of understanding that BabyBot is developing about this stuff is different, it seems, from a machine that's learning about the world by looking at photographs. Whether one is better or worse than the other, again, we'll hold back for a moment, but clearly very, very different approaches to teaching machines about the world that they will inhabit, or that we're about to let them inhabit. Okay, let's keep going. Other building blocks of intelligence. So it's important to be able to recognize patterns that are occurring right now. Also, it's a good idea to be able to plan or prospect, to sort of daydream about what might occur in the future, to imagine, plan ahead, and so on. Actually, a lot of folks have been trying to formally define intelligence, and the one I like the best is something is intelligent if it can avoid getting trapped in a corner in the future. You think about what's coming, and you do things in the present to make sure that you don't have limited options in the future. Hopefully, many of you are here at university right now because you're hoping to not close doors for yourself in the future, keeping your options open. Yeah? So planning or thinking into the future somehow, many people would sort of acknowledge, yeah, that's probably an important part of intelligence. Okay, people have been working on computer algorithms that are good at planning ahead for a long time, like IBM and Deep Blue. It took a while again for this approach to start working, but then it really started working when? Any chess aficionados here? Close, very close, okay. So machines started to, the first time machines really started to beat humans on our own territory, chess, math, poetry, art, the things that only humans are really good at, 96. And Kasparov said, well, okay, yeah, it won its first game, but I won the match. That didn't last very long. Okay. Anyone know how Deep Blue works, generally speaking?
I don't know how, but I would be surprised if it's just a really big tree.
It's a really big tree, absolutely. It's called a min-max tree. So I'm Deep Blue, I'm white, I get to move first. So there's however many moves I have that are possible. For each one of those moves, I then build a tree of every possible move that Kasparov could play in response. And for every move that Kasparov could make in response, I'm going to consider all of these counter moves. So imagine a tree with a root of my move, followed by a whole bunch of their possible moves, followed by a whole bunch of my moves, and so on. And at some point, I get down in the depths of these trees, I can kind of estimate how good my position would be and how good Kasparov's position would be. And then I start to propagate that prospection, that idea about a future state, back up the tree. And then once I've done that for all the nodes in the tree, I start to descend the tree in a min-max way. I make a move that minimizes Kasparov's chances, and I then make my next move based on maximizing my own chances, and so on. No neural network, a big, big tree. Sounds a lot like an if-then-else statement, but it works if you can make a big enough tree. So this idea, this algorithm had been around for a long time, but it wasn't until the mid-90s that hardware caught up in order to build a big enough tree that we're no longer the best species at chess on the planet. Okay. Here's not a chess-playing robot, but a robot that can also plan ahead. This is Shakey the robot, was actually introduced in the late 1960s. I'm going to make fun of Shakey for a moment, but let me start by saying this was an incredible work of engineering. Also a really interesting creative effort, was the state of the art at the time for many reasons. One of them is that you'll notice that the computers that run Shakey are on board the robot. This blew everybody's mind at the time. This was science fiction. This is it. We're one step away from humanoid general purpose robots when Shakey was introduced. Okay. Shakey the robot was put in a lab at Stanford, and they put a whole bunch of big obstacles around it, and then there was an open door. They left the lab door open, and Shakey's job was get out of the room. This was one of the original escape rooms for robots. Okay, so what did Shakey do? Well, Shakey would obviously do what Turing machines do. Remember, we talked about the history of AI last time. A lot of thinking in the West, going back a long time, influences how we think about, obviously, how we should build machines. Turing machines sense first, they think a little bit, and then they act. It's obvious that that's how things work. Before I talk about that, back to BabyBot for a moment. BabyBot didn't passively wait for input, think, and then act. BabyBot kind of did the opposite. BabyBot, like human babies, just acted, just do stuff. And all of a sudden, this wonderful flow of useful information starts to flow back. For BabyBot, it was act first and think later. For most robots at the time and other AI algorithms, sit passively, receive information, cogitate, and then act. So Shakey would use its television camera up here and its rangefinder to scan the entire room and then make an internal model of that room. This is not the internal model that Shakey made. This was just, when I made this slide, I was working on this particular physics engine, so they don't quite match up, but you get the idea. It made a rich internal model of what was around it. And then inside that world, it would plan. If Shakey was actually this blue robot in the middle, it would plan out different trajectories, search over the space of all trajectories that it thought about, and find a path out of the room. So Shakey scanned the room and then spent some time modeling and planning, and then Shakey would move. Why do you think Shakey is called Shakey the robot? Shakey would move about an inch, stop, scan the room, model, plan. It would take Shakey about 7 or 8 hours to leave the room, right? Hilarious, what a stupid machine. Again, remember, this is the late 1960s. This was world-shattering for most roboticists at the time. So, took Shakey a while to find its way out of the room. It eventually did. And part of the limitation, the reason why it took it so long is part of the limitations of hardware and software at the time. But there was also an intellectual impediment here. There's something else that was slowing Shakey down other than just its hardware and software.
It's like knowledge of where it is like only kind of like relative to like its processing.
doesn't really think about like where it was and where it is now.
That's right, exact. For Shakey, more or less it's trapped in the present. It does plan a little bit. It does think about the future. It doesn't, do much with it, but yes. That is maybe a limitation. Maybe we should have given it an ability to sort of live in the future a little bit more. When this class ends and you pack up and you head for the door, are you doing this? I don't think so. I don't see most of you doing this. Doesn't seem like what you're doing. And obviously, you're not limited by your hardware. Your hardware is fantastic. Shakey, even if Shakey had good hardware, it was designed to stop moving, look around, think, and then move, right? Why does Shakey do that? Because the folks that built Shakey knew about Turing machines, and that's what Turing machines do. They scan the tape. They don't move. They scan, they cogitate, and then the machine moves or they move the tape. Doesn't really matter. Sensing, thinking, and acting are separate things, and they're separated in time in a Turing machine. Therefore, that's probably what organisms do, and that's probably what we should make machines do. We are influenced by our intellectual history. In the West, that's Descartes and Turing, and thinking about thinking is misleading. If I hadn't shown you all of this and asked you how you get out of the room, you might have given me an answer like this. I look around, I think about what to do, I pack up my bag, then I think again, what am I doing? Off I go. It's not what you're doing, though. You, of course, are sensing, thinking, and acting in parallel all the time, continuously. If you think about it, you know that's what you're doing, but now that's a harder thing to build into machines. Most of you have a physics engine up and running. You can get your virtual robot in there to sense, think, and act in parallel. We're not going to do that in the assignments. We're going to make things simple, like Shakey here. But that's closer to reality. Not surprisingly, most organisms on Earth that did adopt this way of doing things, sensing, thinking, and then acting, they're not really around anymore. Why not? In nature, it's definitely not a good way to do things. What's that? They got outcompeted, they got eaten, they starved, they didn't get the mate. Not a good thing, right? No matter who or what you are in nature, standing around doing nothing, usually not such a good idea. We're having to stand around and just think and not sense and not act, not a good idea. Okay. All right, just for fun, we're going to take a little bit of a digression here into a contentious building block of intelligence, free will. Okay, all right. I attacked you last time throughout the history of AI that you're not the unique snowflake, or we as humans are not the unique snowflakes that we think we are. We're only Bratenberg vehicles, maybe. Okay, how about free will? Here we go. All right. It feels like we have free will. You may or may not have it. It certainly, most of the time, feels like you choose to come to class or you choose not to come to class. Okay. A paper was published back in the early 1980s. Has anyone seen the Libet experiment before? Anyone taken a psych class and seen this before? No? Okay, great. You're in for a treat. Okay, here we go. Libet and his colleagues invited a whole bunch of human subjects into the lab, and they kitted them out with an EEG strap around their forehead and an EMG strap around their index finger. What's EEG and what's EMG? Nobody remember? Okay, EEG, electroencephalography, encephal, the head-related. An EEG picks up brain activity, at least brain activity near the inner surface of the skull. It doesn't scan the stuff going on deep inside your brain, but it gets a fair bit. Luckily, most of your prefrontal cortex, which is up here, the stuff involved in executive function, the stuff where you decide to execute an action, that tends to be right up here near the inner surface of your forehead. And that gets pretty well picked up by an EEG. EMG, the M is for myo, Latin for muscle. So if you're wearing an EMG patch or strap on your finger, every time your muscles contract, the sensor picks it up. The EMG sensor picks it up. Okay. Libet and his colleagues asked these human subjects to watch an analog clock. So there was a red dot moving around the circumference of a clock. And the researchers asked the human subjects to freely decide at any point they chose to move their finger and move their finger. So if the human subjects were obeying the instructions of the experiment, I'm watching the dot and it gets to 10, and at 10 I decide to move my finger and I move my finger. Okay. What did the experimenters saw? They saw and then people had to write a form. They said, I decided right when the red dot was on 10, that's when I decided to move my finger. So we have human subjects reporting what we're gonna refer to here as 0 milliseconds, the onset of the action. At this moment, the human subjects would fill that out. And it turns out that for most human subjects who did this multiple times, so I choose at 10, now I choose at 7, now I choose at 23, and when the experimenters went and looked at the EEG from that human subject, they'd see at 10 and at 7 and at 23 that there was a particular change in their EEG signal. So it seems the human subjects, most of them were telling the truth. They said they made a decision at a certain point of time, and there seemed to be a consistent change in the EE signal at that time. And for most human subjects, about 0.2 of a second later, there was also a spike in their EMG signal, which was also looking good. When you make a decision to twitch your index finger, it takes about 0.2 of a second for that decision, which presumably happens around here somewhere, to make it out here. So at this point, Libet and his colleagues seemed to have enough human subjects which were obeying the rules of the game. So far, so good. Nothing very strange happening. Libet and his colleagues then took the EEG scan from all of these human subjects, and they went backwards in time. And what they found is that whenever there was this shift in the EEG pattern for a human subject when they decided to move their finger, there was also a consistent pattern that appeared 0.3 of a second earlier than that. So for all the human subjects that are choosing arbitrary times to move their finger, something happened at their EEG at that time, but there was also a consistent pattern 0.3 of a second before that. That's my best description of the data. What do you take away from that data, if anything? What are the implications of that?
Something happened 0.3 of a second before you thought of doing that action, and then when you actually did it, it was the 0.2 of a second.
So 0.3 of a second before you thought you made the decision to move your finger, something happened. That was always correlated with when you eventually moved your finger. And they scanned the rest of the EEG, and that pattern wasn't there other times. What are the implications of that? What does that mean?
Is that just the moment you're thinking about whether or not you want to move your finger?
Maybe. I don't know. All we have is the data. What does it mean? If you ask these subjects, and Libet and his colleagues did ask these subjects, they just decided. Some of them were thinking, okay, maybe I'm going to do it at 10, maybe I'll do it at 17. Others just kind of 10, 17. Some of them reported that they were thinking about it beforehand, some that they weren't thinking about it beforehand. For all of them, 0.3 of a second before something happened. So who made the decision? Where did the decision to move the finger come from? Your comfortable concept that you have free will is on trial here, so think carefully.
It's just possible that there is a delay between when you're making the decision and when you're registering the time.
Delay, yeah, well, this is all about delay.
If they're, like, if they have to be watching the clock to see when they're making their decision,
Yep.
just be that they make the decision to move their finger, and there's a delay, like, they make the decision, see the time, and then move their finger.
If they did that, there would be a greater delay between these things. So this is between these two events. This is the time that most human subjects reported. That's when I decided to move my finger. When the dot got to that number, and I made the decision. So they're watching a clock. So we're talking about photons, speed of light. So not much delay from the clock to the eyes. From the human subject's perspective, if you ask them, when did you decide and act, this is when they did it. I'm sorry, I forgot to give you a detail that's a little bit confusing. They were asked to not plan ahead. Just watch the dot, and at some point, make the decision and immediately move your finger. Don't watch the clock and decide you're going to do it when the dot gets to 17. Sorry, this is a little confusing. They tried to corroborate with the human subjects, is that what happened? So the experimenters know at 17.2 seconds, the finger moved. The human subject said, I made the decision when the dot got to 17. And then at 14, something was happening, consistently happening that preceded those two events.
I also wonder if it's a like anticipation type of decision where they're like, oh, I'm going to do it at 10 seconds, but there's a bit of an anticipation of like, I'm going to do it right on 10 seconds, so I have to anticipate that a little bit. So their brain made an unconscious decision to like, be ready at 10 seconds, and then decided, now go, it's 10 seconds.
It could absolutely have been that way, right? So they happened to move at 10, but they reported, I did it at 10, but they were sort of anticipating about 3, they sort of subliminally or subconsciously knew, I got to be ready, right? It's like if you're shooting a bow and arrow at something that's moving, you got to be a little bit ahead of your target, maybe. So you mentioned subconsciously. One interpretation, not the only interpretation of this data, is that the person subconsciously made the decision to move their finger at this time and then consciously thought, in retrospect, no, I made the decision now at this time, and then look, I moved my finger. If that interpretation ends up being true, that's kind of problematic for free will. If you're subconsciously deciding something, do you have control over it? By definition, things that happen in your subconscious are outside the control of your conscious mind. A little tricky. This experiment has been replicated many, many different times with different types of humans, and it turns out some folks have found consistently reoccurring patterns in the EEG data, not just milliseconds before, but seconds before, which is even more problematic. Tens of seconds before. We don't have near enough time to go into all of the work that's followed the Libet experiment. Fascinating. I want to just bring it out as a particularly glaring example of thinking about thinking and how it's misleading. Introspection is dangerous. These subjects were asked to introspect, and it seems that their reports are unreliable, at least when they report when they decided to move their finger. You've all now, hopefully in this course, had a little bit of experience with already how thinking about thinking is misleading. Okay, let's go back to Shakey for a moment. It's obvious when we think about thinking, it's obvious that we get some information from the world, we think about it, and then we act. That led roboticists off track in the 60s and 70s. In the 80s, Rod Brooks, a roboticist at MIT, realized that and started a revolution in robotics that militated against the Shakey approach, against the sense, think, act model. And he wrote down an algorithm that became known as the Subsumption architecture. And it works as follows. I want you to remember the Bradenberg vehicles from last time. A Bradenberg vehicle, or at least most of them, are made up of 2 sensors, 2 motors, and 2 wires. 2 sensors, we've got 2 motors controlling 2 wheels in the back, and we've got a couple of wires connecting them. Let's assume that these 2 sensors to start with are obstacle sensors. If, for example, a Bradenberg vehicle detects an object very close to the obstacle sensor on its left, it's going to, in this case, turn towards it. That's not what we want. We want a robot that avoids an obstacle. So more obstacleness on the left, spin the left wheel and turn away from it. And this little cartoon down here, this avoid obstacle, you can think of that as instantiating these 2 wires. So obstacle sensors report in some information, the robot thinks about it, and then sends the results of this computation to the wheels, and it avoids an obstacle. Okay. What happens if there's no obstacles nearby? Both of these sensors are quiet. If that happens, this whole circuit goes quiet, and the one above takes over. So assume that this robot also has some audio sensors as well, front left and front back. And if there's a loud noise, it will turn away from that noise. But if in turning away from the noise, if in avoiding the loud noise, suddenly the right obstacle sensor starts to fire, this component subsumes or grabs control of the motors. By putting the avoid noise box above the avoid obstacle box, this is representing that things lower down are more urgent and more important. If there's a conflict between these two, the robot is detecting simultaneously noise and an obstacle. It should ignore it, and the more urgent one should subsume or take control of the motors. If there's no obstacles nearby and there's no loud noise being detected, then turn towards the light. So you can think of these boxes as a whole bunch of different Bradenbergs stacked up inside one robot. You'll notice that these behaviors are arranged in parallel, not serial. It's not avoid an obstacle, then avoid loud noise, then follow the light. They're all actually running at once. All of these algorithms are being executed in parallel, and something is deciding which one is allowed to grab control of the motors, so that one behavior is always in control of the motors at any given time. And this is kind of the most important aspect of subsumption architecture. A robot that's being run by subsumption is always in motion. Most of you are sitting quietly right now, and it doesn't sort of feel like you're in motion, but you are. Your eyes are saccading. They're jumping from me to the slide, to your notebook, to your phone, to me, to your slide. You are also always in motion. And things that are coming in are influencing what your eyes do and maybe what your hand does with a pen or a stylus. You are always in motion, including when you're asleep. We are never still. Okay. We just said this part. Okay, that's the subsumption architecture that Brooks introduced. And in his lab at MIT, he started to have a growing number of simple wheeled robots running around doing kind of useful things, simple things, but useful things, and they were always in motion. Students in Brooks's lab noticed that, what a surprise, a lab tends to be a pretty dirty place. People were tracking mud in and dirt. They noticed that some of these wheeled robots, just by doing this, ended up cleaning up the floor a little bit, which led to an idea. let's commercialize these things. Why don't we make a robot that's actually useful to folks? We can't make a dishwasher loading robot yet. We don't have a general housekeeping robot yet. Let's make a vacuum cleaner. Rod Brooks is the CEO of iRobot, whose first product was the Roomba vacuum cleaner, some of which you might have at home. So I misspoke when I mentioned Roomba last week. Roomba actually does not just turn towards more dirt. It'll also move away when it bumps into obstacles. I don't know if it does anymore, but there was a version that when it heard the screech of a cat would turn in the opposite direction. Not too difficult. Again, if you're sort of comfortable with PyBullet at this point, you can sit down and make a little simple Roomba being run by Subsumption architecture pretty easily. Okay. So we've seen a few examples of things done in an embodied and non-embodied way. So again, let's try and define embodied cognition. I gave you kind of the tongue-in-cheek definition. Push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. More generally, the way that you process information, the way that every organism on the planet processes information, is affected by the fact that you have a body. And what is it about the body that influences how you process information? It's the fact that your body is a tool with which to push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. Okay, so at this point, question?
Yeah, I was about to ask what counts as a body.
What counts as exactly, what counts as a body? Okay, so this thing has a body. Your tablets on your desk have a body. Does that count as a body from the perspective of embodied cognition? You can guess what I'm going to say. The answer is no. Why not?
Can't affect its environment.
It can't affect its environment much, right? This thing, when it's in my pocket, it can sort of vibrate and I'll feel it. So it can push against the world a little bit, where the world is me. It's got a little bit of embodied cognition. If your device is well behaved, it sometimes knows when it can vibrate and when it can't, right? So for purposes today, we're making this very black and white dichotomous distinction between things that aren't embodied and things that are. But it's, as everything interesting is, there's a bit of a gradation, a gray area. Okay, so when you think about this, think about all of the devices, like that device, for example. There's one that's kind of interesting out in the hall. Does it count as a body, right? Is it something that can autonomously, given its programming, to decide to push against the world and observe how the world pushes back? Here's my little Lego robot over here. This is arguably a much simpler machine than this is, but this is more embodied. This body is more embodied than this body because this body can move and immediately sense, it can move and sense the repercussions of its actions. Okay. Importantly, it's immediate feedback, like BabyBot. When I do this, this happens. Okay. Non-embodied technologies, all the way from the simplest computers all the way up to state-of-the-art ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion, they're passive. They have to wait to get stuff from other people or from the internet. They can't go out and get stuff on their own, at least not yet. Okay. A related concept that we're going to talk about a little bit on and off in this course is situated cognition, which is similar to, but different from embodied cognition. Situated cognition, I don't like this definition very much because it's a little circular. The way you process information is affected by the fact that you're physically situated in the world. So situatedness, you can think of this as like the immediacy from what's happening out there in the world to picking up on it. So the chair is shaking and I'm immediately picking it up. It's not that the chair is shaking and that information is being stored somewhere and I've got to go collect that from the internet or somewhere else. It's immediate. I feel it when it happens. That's being situated in the world. Okay, the intelligent light sensors over in the Davis Center, if you've ever been sitting quietly by yourself in one of the rooms over there, if you're quiet and still for a while, the lights will turn off and you have to do this to turn the lights back on. That's a situated but non-embodied device. That intelligent motion light sensor thing, it has a body, but it has limited ability to push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. It's kind of stuck in the ceiling, but it's situated. When stuff happens, that sensor immediately picks it up and triggers actions.
Would you count a LiDAR as embodied because it's like using lasers and then like
Okay.
it's using like
Yep.
echolocation?
Yeah. Oh, echolocation. So echolocation of bats or LiDAR on autonomous vehicles is a form of embodiment, right? There, you're sending out a laser pulse or sonar or ultrasound, and you're measuring the time that it takes for whatever you sent out in the world to come back. Absolutely. That's embodiment. Things that are more embodied can make better use of that and exploit that. Okay. So I just gave you an example of embedded devices. These are sort of sensors that can't really move, and they have limited ability to do things to the world, but they immediately pick up stuff that's happening around them. Things are happening in real time. They're picking up on it, and it's not under the control of the thing, the embedded device. Stuff is just happening, and they can't help but pick up that information. You might have something that's sensing vibration. If that thing itself is being vibrated, that's it. It's real time, it's happening. It's not something that's happening somewhere else and is being stored, and I can dip into that data source at my leisure. Okay. You're immersed or situated in what's happening. Okay. All right, I already talked about this. Okay, yeah. All right. We're going to talk about embodied, non-embodied things in this class, situated, non-situated things in this class. From time to time, I'll talk about a complete agent. The term agent, like vehicle for Bratenberg, agent is going to be a catch-all term for organisms and machines. Just stuff that can move around and sense things. Okay. A complete agent is both situated and embodied. And most of the robots that we're going to talk about in this course are exactly that. They're both embodied and situated. If you are both embodied and situated, interesting things start to happen. There's several repercussions or opportunities for those kinds of agents that distinguish them from agents that are just embodied, just situated, or neither. First thing is that if you're embodied, if you have a physical body, you're subject to the laws of physics. If you can act as well, if you're embodied and you have a body with which you can push against the world and observe how the world pushes back, you're not just subject to the laws of physics, but you can exploit the laws of physics to do what it is you want to do. The Cartesian worldview kind of looks dimly on the body. The body is temporary, it's always breaking down, it gets old, but the thing inside, at least for Descartes, lived forever. So bodies often have a bad rap because they're subject to the laws of freedom. Let's liberate our brains and upload ourselves to the cloud. Let's make ChatGPT an AGI that's just pure code. It can run at the speed of electrons or possibly photons. Liberate it from the body, and we can do more, be faster, be our best selves. That's very much an inheritance from Cartesian ways of thinking. Bodies are not necessarily subject to or prisoners of the laws of gravity. They're laws of physics or laws of gravity, laws of momentum, inertia. But embodied agents can flip that around and make that from a bug into a feature. You're embodied. You exploit the fact that you are subject to the laws of physics all the time. How so? We walk. One of the things we do best. One of the things that humans are really actually good at. We'll talk about this when we get to the lecture on bipedal locomotion. But as you're walking, the moment your foot leaves the ground, you actually relax all the muscles in your leg. And what happens? You start exploiting the laws of physics. Which ones? Momentum And gravity, right? Gravity starts to pull your back leg down towards the earth, and that pull starts to accelerate your leg, high school physics, and then momentum and inertia tell us that once it starts to accelerate, you get this part, the part where your leg is acting against gravity, you get that for free. You don't need to expend an ounce of energy to do so. That's why we are so good at walking. If you're in relatively good shape, you can travel at a leisurely walking speed for miles and miles and miles on half a Big Mac. It's amazing. Roboticists always are jealous of this fact. All the machines that we make, even the wheeled ones, not as efficient. Okay. I'll leave you homework to think about ways in which you exploit this. We've got 5 more minutes. One of the other things about a complete agent is if you're embodied and you're moving around in the world, you generate sensory stimulation in real time, which you pick up on through your sensors, the situated part of yourself. What are some examples of how you exploit that specific loop? In the walking example, you can actually do a lot of walking without exploiting the sensory feedback that's coming back. You do use it, but you don't really exploit it very much. What are some other behaviors where you're exploiting the laws of physics to do stuff, and then you're exploiting the kind of stuff you get back? What's that? Cooking. How so? Okay, yeah, so you taste stuff, season stuff. There's a lot of actions and sensory repercussions going on in cooking. But I want us to try and focus on not just the actions of sensation, which require you maybe to bring food to your mouth. So it certainly involves sensors and motors. But what are some examples of exploiting stuff where you do actions that create the sensory stuff you need? We saw an example of this already with BabyBot. It does stuff and suddenly starts to get all of this information for free. Absolutely, right? So how heavy is this chair? I'm performing a particular action to learn about how heavy it is. I could perform this action. It doesn't tell me much about how heavy this chair is. I could also wind up and give it as hard a whack as I can. I may or may not learn. There's a very small subset of actions actually that'll help me estimate the weight of this. A lot of you are in shared housing and everyone else in your flat drinks your milk. So you pull out your milk and you're wondering how much is in there. Assuming it's an opaque carton, what do? Twisting it like this will not tell you how much is in there. There's a subset of actions that'll tell you how much milk is left. We do it all the time. We choose particular actions that are designed. Those actions are designed by the motor part of your brain so that when you get the sensory repercussion, it's going to tell you what you want to know, how much milk is in the carton. Okay. When you act, you don't just generate sensory repercussions for yourself, but when you act, you often leave an impression on the world itself, which then sometimes becomes sensory repercussions for other people. We also exploit that aspect of the sensor motor loop all the time. What are some examples of that? Okay, yes, you hold the door open because you know somebody's coming. So that's social cognition. I'm gonna try and limit us to thinking about things that you do that just leave an imprint on the world, which either you hope that it helps other people or you don't. Maybe you don't even care, but it does end up helping other folks or influencing their behavior.
I was gonna say, if there's a bear chasing you and you scream really loud, other people hear that and know that there's something dangerous there.
Okay, yes, okay. And maybe you're just screaming because you're in mortal terror. Maybe you're doing it for the benefit of your fellow man and woman. I don't know. Other examples. You open a door, okay? It affects the environment. Of course, everything you do does affect the environment. Absolutely. I always hope that when I give this lecture that it snowed the night before.
Yeah, I was just thinking that when you walk and then you have your footprints and then other people can follow in your footprints so they don't have to break the fresh snow.
absolutely, right? It's minus 10 outside. You got an 8:30 class, damn it. And you're late. What do? You run across the quad, even if there's snow. You leave footsteps, right? What does the next student who's also late do? They literally follow in your footsteps, right? A good example for us at this time of year happens all the time. Ants actually are particularly good at exploiting this aspect of being a complete agent. Okay, we're out of time, so I'm going to give you the punchline here. We talked about embodied and situated cognition today. They're similar, but not related. So for a moment, I want you to think about things that are neither embodied nor situated, typical computers. Situated, but not embodied, which are the intelligent light sensors we talked about. Embodied and situated, complete agents, which is us, Roombas, autonomous vehicles, avatars in games. I put this one up here because I haven't said anything about physicality yet. You can push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. Your world may be virtual and you may be virtual. Embodied, but not situated. You're an industrial robot in a car manufacturing plant, and you've been programmed to weld, 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 weld. You act on the world, but you don't necessarily need to sense the repercussions of your actions. You have a quiz due tonight. You're working on assignments 2, 3, and 4. See you back here on Tuesday. Thank you.